Hello everyone, and we're back with Battlesector, because in this video we're going to talk about all the playable factions in the game, a video kindly sponsored by our friends at Slytherin, the developers of this title, who asked me, hey, can you talk to your viewers and tell them how each of the factions play? There is a lot to talk about with this game, and of course we've already talked about the Ultramarines and the rest of the title in the previous video. Let's talk about all the factions that you can play in this game. So Battlesector's been out for a few years now and has been receiving consistent faction packs over that term of support. As I've stated before many times, they've also had loads of different ways to play the game, but the main thing here is the factions. You'll see the Blood Angels, the Tyranids, the Necrons, the Adeptus Sororitas or Sisters of Battle, the Khorne Demons, Orcs, Tau, Astra Militarum, Black Legion, and finally the Ultramarines, which have recently been added in. Now, it's important to understand the differences between the factions. For example, the Blood Angels are going to focus around the devastation of Baal, meaning that not only do you have access to primaris units, but also access to Firstborn Marines, so the ones that you're very much used to before the rise of the primaris, and some specialized units like, obviously, the Death Company or the Sanguinary Priest. What differentiates them from other Space Marine factions, or other factions in general, is the fact that the Blood Angels move on very fast attack. While their roster can make them quite well-rounded, you can be very quick striking from quite long distances with your jump packs and surprising your enemy. It makes them very, very killy. Remember this as we start looking towards all the others, because the factions will vary dramatically. Tyranids are up next, and you've got quite a lot here, between very large single-entity monsters to very massive amounts of swarm units. The idea here is playing as the tabletop does. So the armies are inspired directly from the tabletop, meaning that your playstyle would be the same. You've got synapse creatures, those big single-entity monsters, which will buff up your smaller units. Now, you can have loads and loads of big monsters, but where you benefit here, in contrast to other factions, is that you can have loads and loads of units coming in, essentially swarming over your enemy. As long as you've got your synapse creatures around, even your little termagants and hormagaunts are going to be very devastating, ripping apart enemy armor. A grand majority of your troops are going to be focused around being mostly melee. You do have range and you do have some artillery, but your speed and the swarm is really where you benefit over anyone else. And the benefit of having loads of different troops on the field is that you can split up and find your enemies quite quickly. It very much depends. You can go single area, but map control with the Tyranids is incredibly important. I played Tyranids way back in the day when it was kind of similar to how it is in this game. Literally just loads and loads of gaunts. And yeah, that's kind of what I like. Necrons next, and this one is a pretty interesting faction because they're very well-rounded, but they very much focus on very punchy shooting. You do have a fair amount of units, and your melee is more than capable to do its damage, but your warriors, your immortals, your death marks, these form the foundations of your armies, where you're doing a fair amount of damage as they take damage themselves and regenerate it. Movement isn't going to be very high here because the Necrons aren't a speedy faction, but what they do excel in is being able to punch through armor. You do have some teleporting melee, and yeah, your vehicles can move around quickly just to get into the flank and the rear. But this is a faction that is kind of based around taking your time. And that's what's always worked well with the Necrons. You can take some heavy fire, but your troops will still be able to regenerate as they move forward. The Adeptus Sororitas, or Sisters of Battle as they're commonly known, are another loyalist faction. And they're going to seem similar to that of Space Marines, where a lot of tech is kind of shared. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. They still have their own unique playstyle because while they have a lot of very strong melee, they also have some buffer units and some very strong flamer units. This is what they do. They purge planets with holy fire. Unlike the Space Marines, the Sisters of Battle will be more closer range. So if you're looking for something a little bit more upfront and personal, and still very damage based, then this is a faction for you. The Demons of Khorne are the smallest faction available in-game, focused purely on, well, the Demons of Khorne. The idea here is very, very strong melee durability when taking bolter fire, and a little bit of range with your skull cannon. But the main basis here is set it and forget it. You can get an army focused purely on melee, throw them straight at the enemy lines and just keep killing and killing. In fact, they get stronger as they kill. The small roster means it's a lot more specialized, meaning that it's probably one of the harder ones to use in my opinion, as you don't really have too much to choose from, but this is how the demons have always been, being split up into separate subgroups depending on the gods. Alright, orcs next, and this is where we get a pretty large roster, as the orcs have quite a lot. It is also quite important to note that some units do have separate weapon options, and the weapon options will drastically change how a unit plays. But it might surprise you, orcs are actually very well rounded, some very strong melee, some pretty decent range. The main focus is being upfront and personal, but it's not like the orcs are going to be a one-trick pony. This is how they've always been on the tabletop too, where, yeah, it depends. Do you want to go speedy? Do you want a lot of choppers? Do you want a lot of big guns? The benefit of the orcs is you can pretty much tailor your armies to your specific want and need, and they're very capable of being very specialized, alongside playing them very similar to that of Space Marines in a way where you can have them mixed up with different units and kind of synergize them there. I like orcs mostly because they're quite loud and they're quite in charge. They're bikers, by the way, very, very strong. Probably one of the best melee units in the game because they're very good at taking out single characters. Tau are actually one of my favorite factions in Warhammer 40k. I've played them since, oh my god, since Fire Warrior. So there's quite a lot when it comes to them. Because what the Tau excel at is range warfare. You've got Pathfinders, you've got Fire Warriors. They can be up close, but then most of the stuff is going to be focused around high movability and high range punch. You're very, very quick at movement. This is one of the benefits of the Tau. You've got access to battlesuits which can get around the area quite quickly, alongside being able to use stealth suits to get to your enemy's flank and rear and hit them quite hard. The benefit of the Tau has always been being outranging most of your enemies too. It is important to note, however, that the Tau are not very good at melee fighting. So you want to avoid your enemies if they're getting too close, fall back and shoot. Gun lines are certainly your friend here. And as always, for the greater good. Astra Militarum, or Imperial Guard, is going to be the faction with the most variants. It doesn't seem like a lot when you just look at the basic roster, but yeah, no, you have a lot, especially when it comes to the tanks. Hell, even your tank commander has a fair amount of different options. So the benefit here with this faction is a lot of big guns. You're going to be able to have a fair and very cheap infantry line because your basic guardsmen are going to be there just to be able to provide support. But if you want to demolish the battlefield, you've got loads and loads of different ways to do so with just a lot of artillery fire. This is reminiscent of the Pask list back in 8th edition Warhammer 40k. So if you just like fielding loads of tanks, this might be the faction for you. It brings me a lot of horror, mostly because I got turned 2'd by that list so many times. It was pretty damn brutal. But it's good to see that here. I know that it's one of those iconic stylings that a lot of people liked back in the day. And yeah, you never know. Hopefully we see it again, especially as Armageddon gets closer. Black Legion are a more recent DLC and your intro to Chaos Space Marines. Having a pretty diverse roster, you've got Demon Engines, you've got Chaos Space Marines, and you've got a fair amount of cultists to use around. The idea here is to focus on either swarming the enemy or kicking the Space Marines' teeth in with essentially a chaotic version of their own tech. I think their breakthrough unit here is just the usability of the Raptors. Very, very powerful, and definitely a very fun faction to play if you want something a little bit more chaotic. We've got 2 entries in Chaos now, and hopefully we won't have to wait too long until future ones, but this is a very good intro. I think the Black Legion is one of the factions that a lot of people kind of go for. The Cultist Spam, again, from 9th edition, very, very popular, and easy to replicate here too. Honestly, makes me want to paint up one of the Venom Crawlers. Now, of course, the most recent DLC that released during Warhammer Skulls is the Ultramarines. Now, I know some people might say, well, we already have a Space Marine faction, why do we need a second? And the idea here is that the Blood Angels and the Ultramarines play very differently. Like I said, the Blood Angels will focus quite a lot on fast attack, whereas the Ultramarines will be quite more well-rounded, being able to specialize and also make up lists which can kind of play as pretty much any chapter that you kind of like. The benefit here also, it's a bunch of new units. The Ultramarines will be focusing purely on the primaris armies, so you won't have firstborns, but you will be focusing on like the brand new Redemptor Dreadnoughts, for example. You've also got access to the Blade Guard Veterans, the Gladiator tanks, which are fairly decent. I've been using them when I did my stream a few days ago, and wow, they really do know how to pack a punch. It's definitely a faction that you're going to want to pick up if you like the more modern style Space Marines, and it definitely works out quite well. I think a lot of people are accepting the primaris now thanks to the fact that it's been a fair amount of years, and also they're starting to have the units that everyone needed. The problem with the primaris originally is that they were introducing loads of new stuff, and it wasn't really updating the very old school Space Marines, which desperately needed updates. And yeah, any primaris that were available before, like for example the basic intercessors, are still available for you to use with your brand new Ultramarines forces. So we do have to talk about some other stuff too. It is important to remember that every faction does play differently, and that does mean that some factions could end up being a natural counter to others. So tailoring your armies is quite important, just like you do on the tabletop. Now there's a ton of different game modes. I know Slytherin, for example, have been doing Battlesector tournaments every now and then, which is really, really nice. I like Planetary Supremacy because that one allows you to have that Doomstacky feel. At a certain point, you can just get as ridiculous armies as you want, and that's always the fun stuff. You know, you can't legally feel that on the tabletop, but you might as well do that in a video game. But you can see here on screen, I am playing as the Blood Angels versus a Tyranid force on a skirmish, because yes, you can get standard skirmishes too if you want to test out certain lists. And yeah, they can hit quite hard. Obviously, my list wasn't really tailored to deal against the Tyranids, but I went on a random army there just to kind of have a little bit of fun. And this is what I like to see. The armor-piercing capacity for the Tyranids doing a lot of damage to my vehicles. The balance that you expect from Warhammer 40k, where different factions again will end up being counters depending on how things go. Obviously, that doesn't mean that it's going to be a massive sweep and you can end up winning. For example, I did here too. But it's definitely very fun, and I do enjoy Slytherin's commitment for new content. It's not one of those titles which are leaving us in the dark for too long. More factions is always great, and as it expands, you know, we're getting new game modes, we're getting new lore. As I've said many times before, the introduction campaign to the Devastation of Baal is probably one of the best ways to introduce people to Warhammer 40,000. So, with all that being said, what is your favorite faction currently playable in Battlesector? Let me know what you guys think in the comments below. Let's start a bit of a discussion, and I'll see you all again very soon. A big thank you once again to Slytherin for sponsoring this video, and I should be live today. I'm not 100% too sure. It depends, because yeah, there's a heat wave going on, and it's pretty brutal. I'm not gonna lie. Even for me, I'm an Iberian, and for some reason it's just kicking me more than regular. So yeah, see you guys. Have a good one.